Hi, I'm here today to talk about the differences between primary sources and secondary sources. Primary sources are works that have been in the public domain, accessible to everyone, and they're not opinion-based sources, but secondary sources are opinion-based. Secondary sources are looking at the primary source and trying to help us understand it or see it in a new way. For example, this is a very famous book. It's a primary source, Emma, Jane Austen's Emma, over 200 years old. I wrote my master's thesis on Emma and on its modern film retellings. And so the film's Clueless would be a primary source. This is something that was adapted from Jane Austen's novel 200 years ago. All right, so that's interesting. My master's thesis ended up being 85 pages, and it had 7 pages of work cited. I only had 3 primary sources or primary examples, but I had 7 more pages of secondary sources. Secondary sources are sources where someone is looking critically at a primary source. And they're analyzing it, and they're getting us to understand or see things that perhaps we hadn't seen before. So here's a book called Jane Austen in Hollywood. And it really is all sorts of articles by smart people who are carrying on a conversation about the relevance of an author who lived 200 years ago and why we keep telling stories. Well, it turns out that there's a lot about Jane Austen's day that we can relate to. One of the themes in Emma is social class, a rigid social class. This is a 1995 film, Clueless, that also looks at the way that we label people, the way that we put people into groups and cliques. In this case, in a high school set in Beverly Hills in 1995. So it's interesting that these themes are still relevant. Well, secondary sources help me understand that. Secondary sources help me understand what political environment Jane Austen was growing up in, where she lived and wrote. Perhaps now we can understand her novels as a cry out for women to have the right to work and to earn their own money and not have to rely on marriage to make it in the world. So Jane Austen was sort of a proto-feminist, and I explored that theme by reading books and articles about Jane Austen and about her books, literary criticism, all of that. That's what helped me write 85 pages. I was spilling over with things to talk about because of secondary sources. And this can apply to anything, whether you're looking at advertising. Well, you need an example of a print ad. That would be a primary source, but you would need secondary sources. Someone like Jean Kilbourne, who has spent most of her life on her crusade to call out the dangerous ways that ads see women in her series called Killing Us Softly. You can see Jean Kilbourne in a TED Talk, for example, where she holds up hundreds of images of primary examples of advertising that are questionable, that normalize violence and exploitation of girls and women. And she sees these things as dangerous. Well, I didn't really see advertising as dangerous until I saw it through the prism of a secondary source like Jean Kilbourne. She shows us that advertising can have an insidious effect and can change the way that we think and see others and ourselves. Secondary sources are the smartest people in the room. They get published in books, they get published in magazines, they get published in documentaries. I was trying to understand the music of Tupac Shakur. I didn't really understand what made him so special for so many people. It wasn't enough for me to listen to some of his music, but after I saw a documentary on Tupac Shakur, then I really started to see that his work was about the violence, inner city violence and racism and all sorts of oppression And that documentary also showed me the charisma of Tupac and his talent. So those secondary sources, I think, help us understand and see the primary examples with more insight. So the way to arm yourself with secondary sources is to use your library databases. Get in there and look for smart people who are writing about those primary examples. And you'll find that you'll be turned into someone who's a voracious learner, a lifelong learner. You want to find out what smart people have to say about whatever issue it is you're exploring. But remember that primary sources are great. Secondary sources help us understand them more. So I hope you go out and start exploring. Use your library databases. There's lots of good stuff out there.